Welcome back to another episode of How to RP1. I'm your host, So Not the Hero Type, and before we begin, I wanted to go over a few things. Now, I started the series because I do see a lot of people out there who wanted to get into the RSS, RO, RP1 stuff, but don't know where to start. I've looked around and there are some tutorials on YouTube, but there's not a lot that go over everything, which is why we're here. I do, however, want to say that just because I play a certain way doesn't make it the only way. KSP is about having fun, building your own rockets, failing, and learning. Just because I do something one way doesn't mean that it's the correct way or it's the wrong way. There are several other amazing RSS/RO players out there, and we all have our own style in how we play. I'm just showing you guys how I get started in an RP1 career to give you some sort of an idea of how to get everything going, how to balance and manage stuff. So with that out of the way, it's time to actually get into the episode. We'll be doing some sounding rockets, some contract management, and most importantly, learning just how to RP1. So in the last episode, we launched our very first successful rocket. Now, if yours didn't go as well as mine did, don't worry, we spilt the second one for a reason, but we have 4.5 science, so we're going to spend it now. I normally like to start off with the first rocketry tab because you get the XLR11, which is one of my favorite early game engines. And we're going to want to go ahead and grab the airplane one because we're going to be doing X-planes coming up soon. Even if your first launch didn't go as well, you still would have gotten some science, so feel free to start spending it just to get the R&D research going. If you're not interested in doing X-planes, don't bother to grab any of the airplane tabs because you don't actually need them. You can use them for the secondary rocketry tab or solid rocket booster or whatever you want to. Just know you don't have to spend those points. We also got a good chunk of funding from that launch, so we're going to upgrade our R&D building, because like rockets, it does take time to research things. Everything with Kerbal construction time takes some sort of time. 120 something days seems like a lot, but once you start getting your upgrades going, it's going to fly by before you know it. Again, we'll still be getting milestone contracts from other launches, but I want to go over and grab some different types of contracts and build a true sounding rocket. So one of the contracts we're going to want to grab is the break the Kármán line contract. Now we know the rocket we have can do that, and this does pay out a good amount of funding. The downrange contract we're not going to be getting to for some time, so don't grab it since you only have 2 slots. And if you really want to launch that second rocket that I recommended you build, you could use it to do the Kármán line contract. We have other sounding rocket contracts, altitude ones and downrange ones. Altitude contracts is basically hit a certain height limit with a certain sounding payload. And downrange is hit a certain distance downrange with a certain payload. It's pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to grab any of those just yet until we see what kind of sounding rocket we can design. Now, some people like to take that Whack Corporal rocket we made earlier and kind of make like a 2-stage version of it. I like to just start with one big one and then build on it from there, which once we hop over to the VAB, you'll see more what I mean. It will cost a decent amount of money to tool and get this rocket going, so if you didn't do as good your first launch, try to get that Kármán line contract done with your first rocket. That way, you could have the funding you need to go ahead and build the second rocket that we're going to be looking into, a true sounding rocket as it can hold sounding payload. Now, I like to start off with my last space rocket, so we're going to use the Mac Corpi. We're going to go ahead and make this a high pressure tank and go into what sounding payload is. It's a type of payload that it's hard to explain. It's basically like an experimental type of payload that you need to have in the rocket. Our current configuration can only hold 20-ish sounding rocket payload, and we need a lot more than that. So the very first thing we're going to do is get rid of this tiny tin booster and aerobee, and we're going to make this rocket bigger. Much bigger. In fact, I usually recommend going for 1.25 meters in diameter, and there's a reason for that I'll touch on a little bit later. You may want to go with a more pointy nose cone comparative to what I did. It may be a little bit more aerodynamically stable. I just personally like this design. Now, as you see, we have that little telemetry unit in the center, and we're going to need some kind of telemetry unit. So we're going to actually clip that in a little bit into the top tank, but we're also going to do some other stuff with it as well. Now, there are a couple different starting engines. You have the A4, you have the XLR. Unfortunately, the A4 doesn't have really any upgrades, so it doesn't last very long. I like using the RD100 early myself, purely because it has a multitude of upgradable engines, which makes it really easy to keep building on to your base design. Now, I'm going through all three of these main engines I'm talking about just to kind of show you what I mean by upgrades. That screen I pull up, when you basically right click it, you can go down to engine and it will pull up this little tab here. You can kind of see what upgrades are available, which once we get to the RD100, you'll actually see like the multitude of upgrades that I'm talking about. And the reason why I think it's one of the better starting engines, especially for the bigger sounding rockets. So once we go through all these engines, we're going to go ahead and put the RD100 on there and then go ahead and build the rest of the rocket. A few things I want to go over is wing design. You can start fresh with your wing design. I usually just take the old wings and then just kind of improve upon them. That way I still keep the same basic design. It's less time to figure it out, but the way you do that is totally up to you. Now typically what I'll do is I'll stretch this tank out until we're about the rated burn time, which is 70 seconds on this particular rocket. I like to have my thrust to weight ratio closer to 2.2 to 2.3, purely because of spin stability, which we're going to be going over here relatively soon. Works a little bit better if you have a little higher thrust off the pad, especially with the downrange rockets. If you don't have a high enough thrust to weight, you'll tip too early, and that can cause the rocket to go down range like you want, but it won't go down range at an angle that's gonna really work. I'm gonna go over the downrange stuff after we build this space rocket to kind of show you what I mean by that exactly. Now, I left the burn time, the rated burn time at 68 seconds because I wanted that 2.3 thrust to weight ratio. We're gonna put the old wings back on it. We're not gonna adjust them just yet because I kind of want to show you how the whole parachute system works. If you're using the base stock parachutes, that's fine, but the radio ones you get with RO are phenomenal with how well you can customize them. So let's go ahead and get rid of that real fast, and we're going to fill this up with sounding payload because I want it to be as full as it can be. And this, it's a little over 500, which is actually really nice because that will last us a few contracts, which is what we want. Something else to keep in mind, you can fill it up to whatever your contract is, but you need the weight up high on the rocket to help keep the center of weight from getting too low. That's something you kind of learn as you go, but again, you don't want the center of mass to drop below the center of lift, or it can cause the rocket to become unstable. Anyways, we're going to slap this parachute on just like that, and I'm actually going to go ahead and clip the telemetry unit just a little bit into the actual nose cone tank. That way it's a little bit more protected and it's not just kind of having a weird gap. I'm also going to use the ring decoupler here in a moment, just to kind of give it a more of a realism feel, because it has basically the way the ring decoupler works is it leaves a small space where the parachute would realistically sit. If you want to use a procedural decoupler because you don't care, that's totally up to you. I just try to make things as realistic as possible and as functional as possible. I usually try to also center the parachute. That's more of a me thing. It's not a requirement. It doesn't make that big of a difference. We're going to go into the quick action groups and click on the parachute. Now, you're going to see a bunch of different options here. One of the more important things is this wet mass to dry mass thing you just saw me click. When you set it to wet mass, it will do the calculations based off the unit it's attached to if it's full, which it will be when it lands. Dry mass is basically when it's been depleted. We won't be depleting any of the sounding payload, so we want to make sure that's set to dry mass. I'm so adamant about that, I didn't talk about anything else. The material thing, if you change your material to silk like I did, it makes it cheaper and it builds faster. But the whole point is you want it to say it was successful, like it did at the end there. Always make sure to hit apply, and always test your rockets out and crash, just to be safe. Now I'm going to go ahead and clip this back in just a little bit and get ready to grab our decoupler unit. Now, for the early sounding rockets, you don't actually have to do any of this decoupling stuff, but I wanted to talk parachutes, so we're going to just skip straight to this. You will at some point start recovering, the telemetry units that you're launching in later launches. So I'm just going to go ahead and build that now. If you want to skip this part for your first few sounding rocket contracts, feel free to do so. Just keep in mind that this whole parachute thing will become necessary relatively soon. Now you see how I kind of showed you what kind of tucks the parachute in there? That's what I like to do. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of quick small adjustments, and then we're going to get down to the wings. I'm going to play this back at real time just so you guys can kind of see the way I make the changes. In future build videos we watch, I'll probably speed through some of this more tedious stuff. I just want you guys to understand the basics. We're going to use that J menu again, and we need to make these bigger because those small little wings aren't going to do anything for this rocket. We're also going to be going into spin stability, which I'm going to show you a real easy way to do that. But the very first thing we need to do is build our base wings. I'm going to go kind of with the same design, maybe a little bit more offset to decrease drag. And honestly, now that I think about it, I probably should have made these a little bit shorter, but I kind of like the way it looks. Feel free to play around and crash until you get something you like. We're getting that weird glitch again where it's not putting the center of lifting correctly. After we reload the VAB or do a quick, simulation, that will fix that. But we're just going to go ahead and get right into spin stability. We're basically going to slightly tilt the wings in one direction, which will cause the aerodynamic forces to spin the rocket, which will keep it going straight or whatever direction we point it at. Too much is bad because it will spin too fast, but not enough is also bad because it will tip before it can spin. I typically just turn off my snap. You have settings if you use the editor Redux to drop it down to 1% turns, but I just prefer to do it without snap and just very, very, very lightly tilt the wing. You're going to see how small I do this. With snap, it could overextend too much. Using the 1 degree snap can make it a lot more fine-tuned. I've been doing this for a while, so I kind of have a feel for it. So don't feel bad if you struggle with this a little bit. Crash is free for us, so just use it until your heart's content. Really learn your rockets and learn how all this stuff works. This is just to kind of show you the basics. A lot of the stuff you're going to have to get a feel for later on. And as you see, I make a bunch of micro adjustments as I go, and it's purely because my lift thing is off. I'm kind of eyeballing it. I've done this a lot, so I sort of know where I need to be. So now I'm just kind of focusing on aesthetics. So you don't have to spend as much time as I do on wings, but until you really get a feel for how they work, I recommend you practice as much as you can. I'm going to speed through these little tweaks because they're not super important. It was more of an aesthetic thing. I wanted them to look better. We're coming to the end of this rocket, but there's one important thing we need to add. And unfortunately this time, more boosters isn't the answer. In just a second, we're going to grab the TT18 decoupler units because it makes a really good base to kind of work on this. I also set my root part to the top nose cone so I can move it around since we clipped the root part into that nose cone. I highly recommend using this particular clamp for this rocket, and there's some reasons about it we'll be going into here shortly. You don't want to put it over the wing like so, or it'll just hit it. You want to make sure it is between the wings so it won't actually hit when it comes off. I'm going to go ahead and speed this next part up and name it the Big Mac Corpy and hope McDonald's doesn't sue me. We're going to do a quick test launch to show you how it kind of works, and then we'll go over that launch clamp we talked about. So now that we're at the launch pad, there's a few things I want to go over. As you see, I have my engine stage and my decoupling stage from the T18 decoupler kind of separate. It's because, like the Aerobee engine, this takes a second to spool up. So we're going to set up all our science, we're going to ignite the engine, wait for it to hit 100% throttle, and then deattach it from the decoupler. That way it launches off at its full thrust to weight and doesn't have a chance to fall down. Now we're mostly doing this particular crash simulation to show you about the whole spin stability thing. I do speed this footage up a bit, it's not spinning as fast as it looks, but right now it's at real time. And that's kind of what you want. You want to spin right around there. It will get a little bit faster, but it's not so fast that it's gonna throw us off aerodynamically. Now I'm using the flight recorder's drag function. You can actually click that and it will show you the drag of your ship, just to kind of see where the amount of drag the wings are causing. This is very helpful if you need to like check the wings of an X-plane or the drag efficiency of a procedural wing you set up and kind of adjust it from there. I recommend you kind of look at all of the tools in that window and just kind of get a feel for it. So our rocket got about 268, 269, nice, meters above the surface, or kilometers above the surface, so we know the limitations of our rocket. The only thing we have to do now is to couple the top piece and hope it can survive re-entry. Once that happens, if the parachute deploys good, there's no destruction of the little nose cone unit, we will have successfully built our very first gen sounding rocket. I'm going to kind of skip through the next bit of this real quick and get over to the VAB to show you guys the downrange part. Parachute worked, nothing blew up. I'm happy with the design. You can copy this design straight off if you want to, or you can make it your own. That's totally up to you. Again, this is to help you guys understand how to get started with RP1. It's not telling you how to play RP1. But anyways, with that, we're going to go ahead and cut over to the VAB, and let's talk downrange. Okay, now that we're back in the VAB, I'm just going to kind of speed through this next few minutes because I'm just checking my center of lift and center of mass and just making sure everything is how I want it. It's a good mindset to have. I probably built 1,000 sounding rockets, and I still double check myself because if you get too arrogant, that's when you make mistakes. No one's perfect. I'm happy with this rocket, so we're gonna go ahead and tool it. I'm confident it can make its money back. It's gonna cost us about $10,000 to tool it. It's kind of a big jump early on, but I prefer to overbuild my first major sounding rocket, and that's where some players actually differ. They like to keep it small and do multiple stage. I like to just do a big one and get ready to go. Now it's time to show you guys the downrange master tip secret. It's quite simple. You make sure your nose cone is set to the root parts. You go to the rotate tool, you turn snap off, and you tilt it one direction. And that's it. You're done. That's the whole trick. Now, it's not actually quite that easy. You want to fine tune the way you have this tilted. We're going to go through 3 crash simulations, well, partial crash simulations, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Right now, we have the rocket pointed too far up. It will go down range, but it's going to go way too high, and we're aiming more for down range with this rocket. So we're going to go through 3 partial crash simulations. Right now, as I said before, we're aimed too high. We're going to open up the flight recorder to see exactly how far down range we get. kind of test it at the current angle. I'm going to kind of speed through this next bit. Basically, we exceed 200,000 meters in the air, but we only make it downrange about 350-ish. We want to aim for 450 to 500 meters downrange, at least for our first rocket. The more you do these, the bigger and the farther you're going to want to go, but we're talking our very first one right now. Even though this is technically a downrange rocket, we could do a lot better. Now, once we kind of get towards the end of this fall, I'm going to kind of cut it off, and then we're going to jump back over to what happens if you tilt it too far forward. Now, as you can see here, we're already going almost 1,000 meters a second, and we're not even close to that 25K mark that I like to aim for. We are tilting way too much. Now, you'd think this would get you more downrange, and technically it would, but you're losing power against aerodynamic drag, you're having heating issues, which is why the rocket's turning red. I have my temp thing turned off, but that red thing, you don't want that. That is not good. You don't want to get so fast in the atmosphere that it caused that problem. We also didn't exceed hitting space. Now, this is kind of the angle you're going to want. We're not too far forward. We're between the 20 and 25 kilometer mark by the time we get around 1,000 meters a second. We're going to get anywhere between 160 and 180 kilometers above the surface, and we're going to get between 450 and 500 meters downrange, and that's a really good base, because I could do a handful of early contracts. And if you want to stretch your tank out a little bit and make it a little bit longer, you can actually get even more out of it. The other thing is, I usually wait till I'm at the top of my AP before I decouple, because it does give it that little bit of a kick. It's not much, but it could be the difference between 499 and 500 when you need to hit that 500 mark to complete a contract. So always test your rocket, get it to how you like it, and then once you get to a rocket you like, we can go ahead and get these built, roll them out to the launch pad, and start completing contracts. Okay, we have our sounding rockets built, designed, they're tooled. We're going to build a couple of them in queue. I usually shortcut them with the plans tab. Now, you're going to want to layer these altitude, downrange, altitude, downrange, because the way the contract system works is the longer it sits, the more it's worth. So just do one every other time, and it's actually the best way to maximize your income. We had 30,000 funds, so I spent another 20,000, so I can go ahead and put another point R&D just to kind of get that research going. Now we still need to grab that contract. We haven't done that yet because we didn't know what our rocket could do. Our rocket can easily complete the difficult one, so we're going to grab that contract, go ahead and build the rocket, and get ready to launch it. I'm kind of circling that, it's worth more because we let it sit for a bit. But always make sure you accept this before you build it, because it has to be a new vessel. So if the rocket builds first and then you accept it, it won't count it. It's kind of weird, but that's how it works. We're going to get the little Mac Corporal rocket out of the way, because we're not going to be needing it. And let's go ahead and warp up, get our rocket on the pad, and get ready to launch our first sounding rocket of this entire episode. And now we're back to the launch pad. Again, we're going to go ahead and make sure all of our science is turned on. You don't want to forget that. Always make sure your staging is good before you launch. We'll go ahead and max the throttle, and we're going to go ahead and light this thing. Now, if everything goes according to plan, we should get a decent height. We should get a couple of milestone contracts, but most importantly, we'll get the Carmen Line contract complete, as well as the altitude sounding rocket contract. Those are our main two focuses. Now, we have watched this rocket fly a handful of times, so I'm going to speed part of this up, because there's not much to talk about as it flies up. But once we get everything wrapped up and get back to the VAB, there's some important things I want to show you guys. And the main reason why I have a parachute and a coupler already on this rocket. Now we're going to slow the footage down just for a second so I can get a nice thumbnail shot and give everyone nausea because I hit the wrong button and now we're locked. We got a great height. We hit a bunch of contracts. You can see them in the corner there. We're getting a load of science for this too because we're actually in space now. And that's worth a little bit more science. And since we got so high up in the air, the hang time we got will allow most of these experiments to get wrapped most of the way up. So the thing about recovering these is even if you don't transmit all the science, you recover it anyways. Once we get back to the VAB, which will be here very shortly, I'm going to show you kind of a cool thing about recovering something that goes into space, at least the first few times you do it. Because when you first recover something that went into space, you get bonus science for it. In fact, you get 8 science the first time, I believe 5 science the second time, but as long as you go into space and recover it, you get bonus science. You get the same thing from putting something into orbit for the first time and then bringing it back down, which is quite a ways away, but you'll get bonus science. We want to get as much science as we can so we can start unlocking new tech and make the space agency more advanced. But with that, we're going to go ahead and cut off to the Space Center now so I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so we're now at the main Space Center menu, and you can see here we got 8 bonus science. So we got 19 science total, or about 19 science total for this whole launch. And if you look over there, we have an upgrade point, which is another thing I wanted to talk about. Every time you generate 20 science points, and it's not at one time, it's collectively, you'll get a free upgrade point. That's $20,000 that you don't have to spend. We're going to go ahead and pop it into our R&D because, again, I want to try to get that stuff done as soon as possible. But it's a cool little feature. And you'll see it in the tips menu when you load into the game sometimes. But I kind of wanted to touch on what that was exactly. Now, we're going to go grab the Downrange contract mission and another mission, but first I decided that I was going to go through the RP1 thing and show you guys how to start your training now that our cockpits are about to be ready. But first things first, let's go ahead and name one of our Kerbals. We're going to name him Ziggy Kerman since he's everybody's favorite test pilot. Now that we have Ziggy Kerman, we're going to go to courses. We're going to click on Proficiency X1. And we can do this since we're researching it. Once it's researched, you can also do it, but you can start researching things earlier. We can select up to 2 pilots and start the course. I say that because like the Gemini capsules take like a year to learn. So you want to start doing it as soon as you start getting the research going. Little trick and tip to help you guys so you're not, fighting to catch back up with your technology. As long as you're researching it, you should be able to do the proficiency training. You can't do the mission training until you unlock it, but you can at least do the long part, which is the proficiency training. Another thing is mission training. You want to wait till a little bit before the launch because it does expire. The proficiency training won't expire. It does make your costs go up a little bit because once our astronauts are more trained, they start costing us more money. We have a more upgraded VAB and R&D. Everything will start to add up a little bit, so always keep your eye on that. Let's go ahead and clear the debris off the pad and pop over to mission control. Okay, now that we're in mission control, we're going to look at our second major milestone contract. Launch something suborbital and retrieve it, which is exactly what our downrange rocket is capable of doing already. We don't have to design anything new. We have a rocket ready to go. After this, the downrange by 300 kilometers is the next big one, which we'll touch on a bit later. We're going to want to grab that and grab one of the downrange contracts we know we can do. We can do the difficult one. It's worth more money. We know we're capable of it. So let's go ahead and accept that one and get ready to launch our downrange variation of the Big Mac Corporal. Now, real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and speed through this. I'm just going to spend some of our money to get some upgrade points to get things moving faster. And then we're going to talk about the edit menu. I was going to do this later, but now is as good as time as any. I start building the rocket because I want it to be built a little bit. So it's like a few percent. And I'm going to show you how the edit function works. You're going to click on the little asterisk next to the rocket you want to edit. And you're going to select the edit box. That is going to take you into the VAB. Now that we're here, we can actually make changes. Like we unlocked a new upgrade for the RD100 and that XLR11, which I'm super excited about. But if we right click it, go to engine, it will give us the option to spend the 5,000 funds and upgrade it to the RD101. We're not going to do that yet. We don't need to. You can if you want to. That's totally fine, but we're not going to do it right now. Something else about tooling I kind of wanted to go over. We could actually stretch this tank up to the 9 meters. We're at like 8.6. We can stretch it up to 9 meters without having to retool it, which would be really nice because when we do upgrade the engine, it's going to take more fuel as it has a bigger burn rate. That's kind of how I design these things. I try to plan ahead as much as I can. The less you have to tool and redo, the more money you can save, the more money you have, the more upgraded you can make your VAB and R&D building, and soon here our VAB building. Or I guess I mean our space plane hangar. That's what I meant to say. Anyways, I was just kind of looking through some upgrade stuff, just looking at some details, but let's get down to the tank. Now we can actually stretch this tank out to the full 9 meters without having to retool it. It's a little bit of wiggle room you get between tooling. As long as it's close enough, you can make small changes and you won't have to retool them. It's sort of dependent on a few things, but in this case, we could go all the way up to 9 meters before having, to retool it if we go any bigger. Get more burn time, and with that upgraded engine, we're going to need the extra fuel. So when we do upgrade it, we'll be able to make it a little bit longer and get more burn time and not have to tool it. But more likely, we're going to actually make it a little bit longer, maybe spend a few bucks on tooling just to get more of a burn time out of it. Always make sure to hit save edit when you're done. We're not going to save anything we did, so I'm going to hit cancel edit. Let's go ahead and roll this out to the launch pad and get to the actual launch. Now this will be the final launch of this episode, so we're going to go ahead and make sure we turn all of our science on. Always remember to do that. We have our little flight recorder pulled up so we can see how well we do. We're going to ignite the engine and we're going to go ahead and launch. I'm going to play this back in real time for you guys just so you can kind of see the flight and how it happens. Now unfortunately something does happen, and another little lesson that you will learn playing RSS RP1, especially if you're using a failure mod like Test Light. This rocket started off great. It had a good launch, everything was going perfectly fine, and then we actually had our first engine failure. Now there are two types of engine failures. There's performance loss, there's early cutoff, well I guess 3 types, and then there's what happens to us, which is catastrophic engine failure and it blows up. That does sometimes happen. It could be from another number of reasons, but long story short, we're not going to be able to successfully complete our mission. So we're going to decouple it, we're going to recover what we can just to get a little bit of science out of it. And that is where we're going to kind of end the episode. So here in a second, we're going to fade over back to the Space Center. We're going to make sure that we take the downrange rocket that was in queue below our altitude rocket and put it to the top of the list, because we still have to do those contracts. Yes, we got some science from it, but we still need to complete those contracts. So if this happens, make sure you put the correct rocket at the top of the queue. I'm going to actually duplicate it so I can, keep them layered like I was talking about earlier. And that's pretty much the end of it. So at this point, I'd like to thank you guys again for stopping by. I hope you guys learned at least something, and I hope these are somewhat helpful. If you liked it, feel free to give the video a like. If you disliked it, give it a thumbs down. You won't hurt my feelings. If you have anything else you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. If you want to see more, go ahead and sub to the channel. There will be 2 different video series I'll be running on this channel. I'm just trying to get some of these episodes out as soon as I can. We're going to be going into X-Planes. That is what Chapter 3 is going to be about. And I just want to say, everything I know about X-Planes is because of Calvin McClure. He's an amazing KSP player. I will link his channel in the description. And I actually asked him for permission before I started shooting this next episode, because so much of what I learned was from this guy. He is amazing, especially when it comes to planes. So please check his channel out, like his videos, sub to him. He really deserves it. He is an amazing KSP player. But I'm going to stop bragging about him and go ahead and stop talking. Thanks again for stopping by, and I hope I see you guys in Chapter 3 of How to RP1.